Hello, everybody. My name is Oliver Laasch, and I'm the author of the textbook Principles of Management, Practicing Ethics, Responsibility, and Sustainability with SAGE. And this session today is in particular about the topics of sustainable, responsible, and ethical operations management. This session, which is openly available on YouTube, of course, for everybody, is in particular dedicated to the DBA students at Lagos Business School, who are taught by my dear old friend and colleague, Kemi Ogunyemi. So let's get into the topic. What is this all about? Good. So this is chapter 15 of the book I just mentioned to you, if you want to go a little bit deeper. And at the end of the session, I will tell you a little bit more about what else you find in the chapter you might be interested in. But first of all, what is this all about? So the idea is that operations management is really what makes your company, which makes the value creation process of the organization you're working in. So that means that we actually need to understand and analyze all of the processes that make your organization, that make your operations go. And the idea is that once we understand it, we're actually able to integrate responsible management activities across all of our operations to make the organization itself more responsible, or to find sustainability related impacts, environmental, social, economic impacts, or to identify particular ethical issues, moral issues in our operations. So the idea is to get that really nuanced appreciation of all of our process, of all of our practice, and how they intertwine and what they do in the widest sense. And this is immensely important, particularly if you look at this thing I dubbed as impressive fact here. I really find it impressive, which is that 96% of CEOs actually believe that sustainability issues need or should be fully integrated, fully embedded, a core essential part of the operations of their company, something that many practitioners call the DNA, in the DNA of their company. So how on earth do we get there? One really good example I use very often is that of IKEA. Maybe you listening, watching this here, you know IKEA. Maybe you have furniture from IKEA. Maybe you've got a shelf like this one, which I bought in IKEA, or the table that you can see right now here, and another rocking chair back there, all from IKEA. So IKEA is in all of our lives. So what they do is really, really important because it affects us, but also vice versa. We as customers of IKEA affect IKEA, what they do, but also we in a certain way share the environmental impact. We share the potential responsibility or ethics issues that the production of all of those things that we have around us relates to. But IKEA is actually a very good company in many ways. And I never say a company is good in general, because we can always find the kind of dark places in any company. But there's something that I like about IKEA, and this is that over a long time, they've been very, very consistently trying to reduce their environmental impact and actually striving for what they call people and planet positive. Over 10 years ago, 2012, this is where they first talked about having a positive impact on the planet, which is quite revolutionary, because of course there have been others before, like Interface Floor, for instance, having their net positive mission. But at the same time, the idea here is that they actually have run that through everything they do, just as I said before, all of the processes, all of the practices. So it goes from having vegan meatballs in the cafeterias up to the timber production process, the forestry behind it, onto recycling or reusing, repairing furniture. And some have said repair is a radical act in a economy that's made for things to be thrown away in order to fuel further consumption. So they've been really, really consistent in rolling that out across their operations. And this is what I find interesting about IKEA, and it very well reflects the spirit of what we have in this particular chapter and in the idea of responsible operations management. And I just mentioned Interface Floor. So this mission zero here is really, really interesting. And this was the kind of the pioneering move that has kicked off and inspired many others to do similar things. So what is this mission zero? It's to understand how everything we do, everything, take, make, and waste affects nature's balance, and ultimately our children and the children of all species. So from this knowledge, we can build processes throughout our business that mimic nature and support the environment. So it's really about naturalizing, renaturalizing human beings, economic systems, about making us a species that can in harmony live on that planet. And it's really interesting also because I know Kemi has been working a lot on the question of who we are as human beings and how that connects to sustainability topics. So I'm sure there's a great discussion to be had. So what does that then mean for responsible operations management? The idea is it is a process-based framework. So we're interested in the processes and in the practices that make an organization. So it is aimed at creating efficiency on the one hand, so to waste less or to increase your output while using less. But also to find out what's the optimum value we can create through our process, so process effectiveness. And with value, I don't only mean economic value or monetary value. No, value takes many different forms for many different stakeholders of that process. It's a different type of value you create for your communities, some of whom might be employees of your company, different type of value for employees, different type of value for employee families, different type of value for your customers, different type of value for the government you pay taxes to or not. So this is the idea. How does all of that come together in the processes that make our organizations? So, if you want to make that a little bit simpler, we can actually look at it in 3 different phases. So phase 1 is you have to analyze and understand your process. So what those ABC dots they are meant to express is the different types of practice and how they come together. And phase 2 is then to be efficient, to actually manipulate this practice in a way that makes sure you do either have less negative impacts from that process with the same output, or you keep the negative impacts the same, but you increase your output. And eco-efficiency is something that we will talk about a lot in that context just in a moment. And then the third one is really, so this is all about being efficient and making sure we can do more with less, or do the same. Or do at least do the same with less. And phase 3 then is to be effective. So there it's all about that stakeholder value that we already mentioned. So what value is coming out of that process? What effect do your processes have? And the idea is if you do all of that well, we end up in a situation that Rick Edgman, who's the lead author on that chapter here, called Responsible Enterprise Excellence. So our enterprise, the operations of our enterprise are responsible, are ethical, are sustainable, and they are excellent because they are that way. So number 1, analyze the process. So how do we start unpacking something like this? So think about our COVID experiences, and here in the UK, for instance, supermarkets quite radically adjusted their operations to the needs of that pandemic, respectively the needs of their customers in that pandemic. And one of the main concerns was really, how do we make sure that vulnerable groups who would suffer from COVID infection very, very strongly in the supermarkets when they're not as crowded. And something that happens actually was that the most supermarkets here, you see just a list of a couple selected ones here, introduced into their normal supermarket operations, introduced that kind of exclusive hour for elderly and vulnerable people, where others weren't actually allowed in. So this is quite a radical change. It sounds like something small. You just pencil like an hour slot, like office hours somewhere onto your where you post your opening hours. But no, this is actually quite radical. But because which store on earth would try to keep paying customers out? This is really, really different. And how do you even organize keeping others out? Do you have people standing at the doors, looking at your ID, having people explain them while they're vulnerable or not? Do you have medics do you have kind of trained medical personnel in the store in order to assess if somebody is vulnerable or not? How do you do that? And then also, how do you manage the amount of customer flow that is very reduced? Do you have less staff in the store software at that time? Do you reorganize how you have your kind of customer guidance to the stores, how you place products for that reason? Do you open only one part of the store with a reduced set of items in there, or do you open up the entire store? So it sounds simple, but making operational changes is very, very complex, and more so if it's very sudden, like in the case of a COVID crisis. But then on the other hand, also we do have those very long run type of operations transformations that we need. And a really good example is net zero carbon emissions, because once again, we have an example where all of the carbon emitted throughout all of our processes, and depending on how many tiers of the carbon emission schemes you're looking at, not only our processes, but also our customers' processes and our suppliers' processes and the processes of the companies that deliver energy to us. So it's immensely complex to understand that network of practices and sub-processes and how much carbon they're actually emitting, or if you're talking about carbon insetting or offsetting, how much carbon is also being captured somewhere else. And to getting to that equation and knowing now I'm net zero in carbon terms, or maybe even regenerative, so I'm actually capturing more carbon through my operations than I'm emitting. So how do you know that, and how do you manage based on the knowledge of where you stand in that process? So imagine something like Bristol Airport here, for instance, which has claimed they want to become zero carbon emissions. So imagine they actually factor in, so one of their suppliers obviously are the companies running airline companies. So if they actually include the carbon emissions of all of the companies flying through their airport, or at least the direct flights onto their airport, how on earth are you going to be able to offset all that, or to be able to reduce the emissions to a degree that you don't offset anymore? How do you develop that power over a global corporation like EasyJet, for instance, where you're just one small airport? It's immensely complex. And this is the kind of challenges that sustainable, responsible, and ethical operations management has to tackle. And very interesting is you can actually start, typically if you have that level of complexity, you try to decompose in a certain way to reduce that level of complexity, to be able to look at subsections of the system at part of it, and to see how do you get it right there before you try to fix the entire system, or you do it in parallel most of the time in iterative ways. So in one way of getting there are those traditional swim lane diagrams. They're really interesting, but this swim lane diagram is not as traditional, because where the traditional swim lane diagrams would have the people, your employees basically carrying out a task, or members of a project team carrying out a task. Here we do have different responsible managers doing that, and thinking about how those responsible managers are embedded in their communities of stakeholders, of people who have an interest in what they're doing and that the managers are interested in. This is what becomes the core consideration here. And I don't want to walk you through this entire program. It's there's a very nicely high resolution printed version of this in the textbook, so have a look at this one, but I want to give you the basic ideas here. So the idea is that throughout this process, you see community manager, people manager, employees. This is the actors involved, and in some cases the stakeholders. So actors can also be stakeholders at the same time, such as in the case of the community members. And you see actually here we do have sub-stakeholder groups, sub-swim lane diagrams, even in the community 1 and 2 up here. So the idea is then throughout those different, across those different actors, and in that network of actors that are involved in that process, we're trying to trace the process through. So where does something start? Where does it go? Who makes what yes or no decision, like down here? Where do we store information and knowledge? Can we store information and knowledge? Where do we have certain documents or standard operating procedures that go into it? And very importantly then is, how do we actually know what good or bad it does? And what we're doing here is to mark that, for instance, here with this this lightning, which marks some kind of ethical or moral issue. So for instance, favoritism, when you're accepting which project, community project you're going to fund. So there might be powerful people who want to have the project of their people, the people they know better, funded over other people's projects. So how do we tackle that kind of conflict of interest, which is in an ethics management task? But then we also have those smiley faces here. So this is where social and values created for stakeholders. So for instance, for the community, if you have a road improvement, for instance, or if a basketball court is being built, or maybe because you have economic impacts on the community in terms of employment. But then also we might have another one down here, employee satisfaction, so directly a value for employees, or up here, what does it say, shared value conservation? All right, so you're trying to find out when you make decisions about which community initiative you support, who's actually benefiting from it. So another opportunity for responsible management and stakeholder value generation. And then we do have those clouds over here, and this is every time we get waste. And in this case, with waste, we mean some type of negative impact, environmentally in particular, in the way how we map it out here. So the idea is then, if you have a map like this, and if you're aware of it, you can start managing. It's not that you just react to things as they occur. Once you notice, oh, there's something going very well or something going wrong. No, you can actually fine-tune, realign, readjust, or completely abandon processes if you think they don't make sense in terms of their impact. So this means analyzing the process. And then, of course, just knowing what's there doesn't really help. The idea is that then you run it through continuous improvement cycles, and particularly the ISO 14000 and 9000. So 14000 is the one for environmental management, and 9000 the one for quality management, help you a lot in that process. So the idea is, once you know what's going on there and you're able to map it, to run through improvement cycles again and again and again and again and again, until you actually think, wow, it's so good now, I can't do anything about it anymore. Or you notice, well, it's not going to get any better, but it's still bad, so we actually have to stop that process. That was phase number one. Phase number two is now, how can I be efficient? And particularly eco-efficiency is interesting there, because the idea is there that we're moving from how many resources, typically translated into financial resources. How much does energy cost for me? How much does water cost? So we're moving from that cost consideration of efficiency and how much do I get out of it, so how many products and how much sales, to move towards an ecologic consideration of that. So all of a sudden, water or energy become important, not because of their cost, but because of their environmental impact. And obviously that makes it a little bit more tricky, because if you're in a city like Manchester here, which is also called the rainy city or Rainchester, obviously water impacts are accounted differently in comparison to a place like San Luis Potosi in Mexico, for instance, where I lived for a long time, which is a high desert, and it rains in huge amounts, maybe once or twice or 3 times a year. So very, very different scenario for what water impact actually means. So that's what we mean with eco-efficiency. And a key consideration always in efficiency is waste. So how can we make sure that we don't do things that do not add value? So whatever in our process is being done, but it doesn't do anything positive, doesn't do anything good, is waste. And waste comes in many different ways. So it could be quite literally non-quality waste. So that's what we first think about in terms of waste. So this is the things that are products that are that are broken up after production, that don't work. For instance, a television that somebody produced and it doesn't switch on. So that would be the most typical type of waste we think of, probably. But also overproduction often is one we might think of. So where we are actually in the food industry, for instance, we've got huge amounts of food waste, and we're producing, I think, about 1/3 more food than people are actually eating, and that other third is being thrown away, and all of the resources that go into the production are being thrown away. But again, we have to broaden our horizon of what waste means. And here are a couple of pointers that you can use if you're interested in that. And well, Muda is just from the Toyota production system originally, this Japanese word for waste that you will see a lot if you're interested in operations management. And this can go to a level where actually waste becomes the core piece of your business model. Like in this case over here, Flawsome Juices out of the UK, they build their business model around waste, around wasted fruits. So they only produce fruit juice from fruits that would have been thrown away otherwise. And at the same time, they recycle, their plastic bottles are entirely recycled, 100%, if I understand correctly. So meaning that they also reduce the waste elsewhere in terms of, not only in terms of food waste, but also in terms of plastic waste, single-use plastic particularly, which is one of the most severe problems that we have on that planet, on this planet. So this was about waste, about being efficient, making sure that the output you produce, you actually produce them with a minimum amount of resources, or you're able to use the same amount of resources and produce more, or you can actually move into both directions, produce more with less. And then the question is really still, how much value and what kind of value do I actually create? And knowing what kind of value I should create is really important upfront, because if you keep a narrow definition of value and you think about economic value, for instance, for your shareholders, or you think about customer satisfaction as a type of value, you get a very, very narrow range of the type of value connected to your operation. So think much wider. We mentioned employee satisfaction, for instance, another type of value. The value communities get out of you being there. You can even think about ecosystem value. So if you are actually one of those businesses, so for instance, regenerative tourism businesses that as part of their activities restore a local ecosystem, well, you could even create value for the environment, for the natural environment around you, for that particular ecosystem. So you have to open up this voice of the customer type of value that we typically see in quality management to start talking about voice of the stakeholder value. And one example is this here about the Slovenian home appliance producer Gorenje. Probably I'm not saying that correctly. I'm very sure I'm not saying that correctly. But I think this image really expresses what you're trying to do. You're moving the attention away from the outside of the organization and focusing on only one group, which would be the customers typically, towards the inside. So we're caring about what employees, for instance, get out of what we're doing in our organization. And we're trying to document that, we're trying to analyze it, we're trying to understand it, and we're trying to see how we can generate more value for them or many other groups as mentioned before. And the funny thing, well, the not really funny, but the often tricky thing with value is that value is as much depending on what makes you unhappy as it depends on what makes you happy. The problem is those dissatisfiers, the ones that make you unhappy, are the ones that can actually keep your delighters, the ones that make you happy, from working. So often we get situations where the baseline expectations, so for instance, a decent wage, if we keep talking about employees, or about or overwork, there's no overwork, those kind of things, that if those dissatisfiers are not being moved out of the way, often the satisfiers, like a bonus, for instance, or like a present, they don't really work. And I can give you a great example of that from my own work experience. So during COVID, obviously in many universities, people worked much more. So imagine how much more time it takes to produce an online lecture from scratch all of a sudden, and all of the problems that students have, of course, all of a sudden, that they can't go to the lecture room anymore, but they have to do everything online. And well, a host of problems, and the estimate is that probably academics worked roughly a third more, until or up to half more hours during times of COVID in their teaching activities for that particular reason. However, for instance, my university, or at least my business school, never paid those additional hours and never really explicitly recognized what was going on there. So in this then what was quite strange, because when then we got a gift voucher, I think about £20 or something, to say thank you for our extra efforts. That did not make me happy. And it probably didn't make many other people very happy, because the dissatisfier, the dissatisfier of injustice, which I felt personally in that moment, kept me from feeling the value of that delighted that I'm getting a present. And it didn't happen. So the idea really there is to make sure that you keep the big picture in mind once again, and you try to put yourself into the shoes of the stakeholders that you want to create value for, and don't see it as an isolated action, as like sending a gift card. So And what helps a lot in that process is you don't get it right first time. That's something we have to accept. So this PDSA cycle, the plan, do, study, act cycle, we talked about the 2 ISO norms and how you have continuous improvement. This here makes it a little bit more concrete. So you plan, you do, you study, and you act. And once again, you plan, you do, you study, and you act based on what you found out of your action, how close you got last time, and what were still issues. So if somebody in my university, for instance, hears that that kind of implicit complaint that I just stated here, well, maybe somebody learns something, studies what they could do better next time, and maybe manage their processes when we come to a similar situation in a way that makes me as an employee and possibly many other employees just a little bit more happy, that creates more value for employees. Good. I'm not going to go through all of those details with you, the entire summary. We did a really quick run through the chapter, so this is probably 20% what's in there, but I think those are the most central 20%. But I also want to highlight a couple of more things I think you might be interested in. So for instance, we have that pioneer interview with Sandra Vadok, who already in the early 2000s coined that term and studied that idea of total responsibility management. So, you know, in operations management, often we do total quality management with a customer focus. And she, together with her co-authors, tried to see, and together with companies, tested and implemented how you could actually manage the quality, the outcome, the value that you generate for all of your key stakeholders. If you want to see how it's being done in practice, have a look at this practitioner profile. Or have a look at that true story. So those are anonymized but true stories of somebody who actually has encountered an issue related to the topic of each of the chapters. All of those end of chapter contents are repeated in each chapter. So the type of heading that we here have here is true story. You have in all of the other chapters, of course, with other true stories. Then we've got a digging deeper section. In this case here, it's about the Shingo and Toyota quality management principles, if you want to go deeper into that part and how they apply to sustainability topics. And then if you want to analyze your own process, well, you could use the template that we have for a swim lane diagram in the book. And of course, there's much more in there. And the word clouds that we have in each chapter at the very end try to express that, to give you a kind of an overview of all of the things you could be interested in and that you might want to go back to in the chapter and have a closer look. Good. So for full reference, have a look at the textbook. I hope you you enjoyed that short session, and please feel free to comment on this video, subscribe to the channel. There's quite a good number of videos now. By now we have one video at least for each chapter of the textbook, and be in touch on LinkedIn. I'm really looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you.